Right. I would be remiss if I didn't say something about notaries, and we'll definitely read some notarial documents, and I just want to give a bit of an overview of the notarial profession and using notarial documents before we get into some classic either wills or marriage contracts or something like that. So this is the manual from Claude Farrière, which I have showed before. That's a manual from the late 17th century, I think, for instructing notaries. So notaries were the fourth most common occupation according to a 15th century census in Geneva. So 87 tailors, 76 day laborers, 72 cobblers, and 64 notaries for a city of about 10,000, probably less than 10,000. So a very common occupation. And notaries make France go around, and most of Europe. Anything that needs to be put on paper, a will, a marriage contract, a property sale, an apprenticeship, art sales, art contracts for or contracts for work, all of that. If you're working on history or literary biography or art history or prosopography or editing volumes of letters or editing trials or anything like that, you will sooner or later end up having to use some notarial documents. Kings need notaries. The one at the top is the marriage contract of Louis XII and Anne de Bretagne. Louis, par la grâce de Dieu, roi de France. And the one below is just, I don't know, some random person's marriage contract. So there are three kinds of notaries in France. There's les notaires royaux, who are appointed by the authority of the king, not necessarily by the king, but they're appointed under the king's authority, and they have the right to pass any sort of act in the ressort, the area that they are authorized in. So wills, wills, marriage contracts, property sales, everything you can think of. Notaires apostoliques are appointed by the bishop and can generally only pass acts within their diocese of appointment, and cannot pass acts between laymen unless it bears on ecclesiastical matters. And then there's the notaires ou tabellions des seigneurs. These are the local ones who can pass acts between subjects of a given seigneur by the authority of that seigneur, and might also manage contracts for the seigneur. There's a lot of variation. Two notaries in the same year in the same town can have a very different handwriting, but there's more variation between individuals than between regions. So this is just two screenshots from just a few pages apart in the registers or the collected protocols of Jean Bag from Beaune in Côte d'Or, so towards Dijon, Burgundy. And I think they're fairly similar, but I think you can even just two of his documents look a bit different. And there's only a bit more difference, I would say. Unfortunately, the bottom one's a bit out of focus, but there's only a bit more difference in the handwriting between a document from Jean Bag in Burgundy and from Claude-Aimé Foral in Geneva. So one of the really key things about notarial documents is they're formulaic, and it's always going to help to learn something about the formulas. This book, La pratique des documents anciens, is oriented towards savoir, but it's really overwhelmingly applies to all of the French-speaking world, and it's quite a terrific book. It's got a chapter on each major type of document. So this is on marriage contracts, and it will kind of tell you what the morphology of the document is and the history and a lot of background that can deepen your reading of those documents if you have to work with them. We already saw this. This is for a reconnaissance. And, they have ones for wills and property sales and so on. So I don't know how many chapters, but excellent resource. And again, most notaries are working from a model, and often not a very good one. So this is the most popular model. This is the Ferrière book again from, 1682. And he, though his book is a set of formulas, he is very dismissive of the notaire de village qui, n'ayant point d'autre science, just copy out of their book, et le trace mot pour mot sur un autre contenu dans le livre, lequel est souvent mal fait. Because their book might, in fact, not even be a print book, but just something they've inherited from the notary who taught them. So here's an example of the formula for a testament from Ferrière. And the important thing is to note that, say, things like the religious statements are just coming right out of the formula. So where it says, premièrement, comme vrai chrétien et catholique, recommande son âme quand elle partira de son corps, etc. This is going to be in the Testament, but it's going to be entirely typically drawn from the notary's book, and often not even figuring in the draft copy. In the draft copy, they're going to focus on the parts that are specific to the individual, and those parts will often be left out. So, generally speaking, there will be three kinds of documents. There's the draft, and the draft is what's done on the fly as the notary talks to the person, sort of the notes, as it were, and they're usually not kept, very rare to find, and usually of no standing. The one exception is there are a quittance, a receipt. A notary might do that, and they give it to the person, and there's one and only one copy, and it's up to the person to hold on to it. But for most things, almost anything you're going to deal with, a marriage contract or a will or something, a draft wouldn't have a legal standing and is extremely rare to find. Then there's the minute. The minute is what's kept in the notary's protocols, his stack of papers, which sometimes are bound and sometimes even have a repertoire at the beginning. And that is kept by the notary in his étude. It would be passed to his successor, and then ultimately, if the étude goes out of business, would be deposited with the state, in theory. Except for a brief period in France where it went to the local garde-note, but that position only existed for about 5 years and then was suppressed. And then finally there's the gros. The gros is the fancy copy. That's usually a wider format. It's neater writing. It's got more sort of flourishes and so forth, and would have all the signatures on it. And that's the copy that's presented to the client. And it is sometimes found in family archives, but most commonly those are lost as well. So almost always what you're dealing with is the minute from the protocol of the notary. So here's an example of a draft, one of the few drafts. This notary has an entire volume of drafts, and it's real interesting because it lets you go from the draft to the minute and see how much change there is. And this one is a marriage contract, but it's actually a marriage contract that was done after the fact, as he says. In fact, where does he? Anyway, doesn't matter. But the key thing is it's 28 lines total. It's a little less than a page. It's a sort of the bottom half of a page and a little less than the top half of the next page. And you can see off on the left it says registré. So that means that he took this copy, his draft, and he put it into his register. He wrote it out long, the good copy. And then we can go to his other register for the same date and find the long copy that he prepares. And this should be word for word what the client would receive. And that's 66 lines total. So it's over twice as long. So that means that a large amount of the language that's in there, over half of the language that's in there, is something that the notary is writing down in absence of the client. And that's where you're going to get a lot of those formulaic things about, his soul and faith in God and so on and so forth. The parts that you can pay attention to are things where they're specifically talking about what to do with property, for example. And that's where a will gets interesting. And then you can see that it says Lu Audit Guichon. So Guichon, it's the mariage de Michel Guichon et Pernette Cuvat. And then it says Lu Audit Guichon. So that means that this version was read to Guichon. And then once Guichon said that yes, it's correct, and he accepts it, it was probably copied out long and then delivered as a gros to Guichon and Cuvat. So the important takeaways for notaries is it's a super important source of information on people. Anytime you are dealing with people or projects, like I say, like what do you call it? Art commissions and architecture, anything like that. A huge array of topics. You're going to have to get into the notaries to find out what happened. And a lot of times it's helpful for determining webs of people. Like even if you're just interested in, say, like Janine Olson working on Calvin's Friends. She did a book on Calvin's Friends. You can look at the notary contracts and see who witnesses, who acts as a witness to a contract, and you can put together a web of relationships based on who the witnesses are, for example. Although quite commonly the witnesses are based on the neighborhood where the notary lives. They're usually the notary's neighbors, but even so, it still tells you, who's in and out of that house and who's in that neighborhood, who's choosing that notary, and so on. And then the formulas help you read the document. If you can find a printed formula, that'll give you a step up. But if you've read, 3 or 4 or 10 of a given type of document, the rest of them will start to get a lot easier because so much, especially at the beginning and end, will be repeated. So it helps you learn a given notary's hand because a lot of it's given. You know where the date's going to be and things like that. But then finally, you just have to be aware that it is formulaic and you can't count on, or you can't put too much stock in the precise wording of things. You can learn a lot from, again, who gets property in a will, what kind of property someone brings to a marriage, who the witnesses are, things like that. But if you start looking at very specific language about, say, particularly religious topics or things like that, you're very likely getting a strong influence from the notary or even the notary's manual and the region that they're in and so forth. So you just have to be careful of that. But in general, notaries are, the notarial archives are super useful. I meant to drop this in the middle, but I just want to show a notarial document that's got a lot of formulaic abbreviation. And this is a préfet, so it's a contract between a mason, this guy Carlet, and actually I forget who, Christophe Moreau, but he's something in the royal administration. Anyway, it's sort of fairly normal, and talking about the muraille that he's going to build, and then let's see, yeah, okay, and ainsi promis et juré par les 10 parties présentes, our sort of standard présente abbreviation, et stipulant, etc. Attendre et tenir, etc. Rendre d'hommage, etc. Prononçant, etc. Et à l'entreteniment de ce que dessus le dit Carlet a obligé sa personne. So we're kind of out of those main abbreviations. Oh, here we go. Et bien, présent et advenir, et le dit Sieur Moreau, c'est bien, etc. Que une I think EXON, I think it's execution of the contract, etc. Voulu, etc. Sous-signé, etc. And then, dans la maison du dit Sieur Moreau. Then we're out of the abbreviations because we get into naming the witnesses. Some high-powered people, Noble Léonard, I don't know, Brujas, B-R-U-J-A-S, I guess, conseiller du roi, et président des élus en l'élection de Bas-Auvergne à Clermont. So, some heavy hitters. And Guillaume Cordier-Clerc, don't know who that is. And then one just interesting thing, not the abbreviations, but it says demeurant au royaume qui ont signé avec le dit Sieur Moreau, et le dit Carlet a dit ne savoir signer. So the Mason doesn't know how to write his own name. And then I guess that's the main points.